Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. We're going to give everybody a minute or two to get signed in, and then we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us.
If anybody that's online right now is concerned that they can't hear us, it is because we are actually not talking right now. So we are giving another 60 seconds or so for everyone to join in, but we're just going to remain on mute until that time frame. Thank you. All right, Teresa, if you're okay with getting started, I think I am. I mean, we're at 2:01. We've got quite a few folks already on, and so let's not punish those that showed up early. So please, by all means, let's start with the introductions.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us. This is our Criminal History Best Practices webinar. And before we really launch into everything, just wanted to let you know, if you have any questions as we go along, please type them into the chat. We will be addressing all questions at the end of the presentation. Right. So with that, leading the presentation today is our very own Greg Kirsch. He's our Chief Operating Compliance Officer. He's an industry-recognized expert in employment screening solutions and compliance with the Fair Credit Reporting Act. My name is Teresa Papanicolaou. There is a test at the end on how to pronounce that. I have all the vowels in my name, so be very careful with it. I'm a national account executive here at AI, and I've been with the company about 2.5 years, but I've been in the industry for well over 15 years at this point. So our objective today is to give you all the information that you might need to understand all the complexities that go into a background screening program, and give you our best practice recommendations for that you can utilize in your organization. Greg is going to lead us through the ins and outs of how background screening companies obtain criminal history information and address the sources of that information. And believe me, this really does come up a lot, so we are prepared to discuss all of the differences between county courts, federal criminal courts, FBI, fingerprinting databases, and national criminal databases. Greg is going to talk with us about how that information becomes a record, the pros and cons of each kind of search that you can perform, and how you can tailor these searches to your programs with best practices in mind. So, Greg, if you want to start us off, how do you define criminal history and where is it stored?
Thanks, Teresa. So I think one of the first things we have to keep in mind when we're having this conversation is that there is no singular kind of one-stop shop for all criminal history that has ever occurred within the United States. So we're going to be focusing on 5 primary, what I'm going to call sources. The first 2 sources that are related to one another are the county court the county court system and the federal district court system. 2 very different systems. We're going to break them both down and also show how the information is housed, how it gets in there, and why those are considered what I would consider true source information. And the second kind of grouping is the state repositories and FBI database. Teresa and I will have several different touch points within here discussing what exactly a state repository is, what that FBI database is, how is it accessed, and then last but not least, the one of these things that is not like the others is the multi-jurisdictional database, often referred to as the National CRIM. And that's its own accordion of sub-level information that we'll discuss and show kind of how that relates overall in the best practices scenario. So first, I want to get just a high level into the county court system. What exactly is it? What kind of information is contained in there? There's approximately 3,000 counties within the United States. I'm sorry, there's actually over 3,000 counties and county court equivalents within the United States. All the information in these systems is public record. In different jurisdictions, they're broken down by upper and lower courts. In some cases, we have superior circuit and district courts, common pleas and magisterial courts. And then even within, when you dive further into these court systems, there's other infrastructure designed to support civil records, family court, traffic, and what I would consider, typically non-criminal information. But since we're focusing on criminal information, I want to go through and just kind of break down exactly what is in these county systems and the information that would be found within them. The vast majority of all criminal history is tried within a county court system. So if you're arrested by the state police or the county sheriff's office or a local police department, the majority of those cases are going to be tried. They're going to be filed within the county court system. The due process is going to take place within that county court system, and the ultimate disposition details will come out of that process, which is, again, very similar to the secondary source we're going to talk about here, which is a federal court system in just a moment. But in this case, you're talking about the state of, so it would be the state of Florida versus John or Jane Doe, or the state of Pennsylvania versus John or Jane Doe. So the arresting agency is an agency within that state. They would, start the entire process, but ultimately it would get handed into the court system for the disposition process.
Greg, just so you know, we can't see you anymore. I think your webcam turned off.
Oh, okay. Let me figure out. Okay, I will try to multitask and solve that problem. I'll solve for X and Y while we're doing that. So.
I did have a question though about the county court system. You said there's over 3,000 counties in the U.S. How then do you know which county court you're going to search for any given candidate?
So the majority of crimes, I guess it starts, the question starts with where do crimes take place? And the majority of studies show the crimes take place within areas where an individual has lived, worked, or went to school. So it's basically associated address history. So you want to define the associated address history of a candidate, and then ultimately search within those jurisdictions to identify that information. Now, when we apply the best practices approach that we're talking about here, there are additional layers that can help bridge some of those gaps, but I don't think there's anybody that would agree that it would be feasible for every single job candidate that would apply to run 3,000 individual county searches and county equivalents across the country just to try to identify 2 to 3 potential criminal history items that would exist on average for someone that does have criminal history. So we're going to use different tools, and that's going to tie a lot into what we're going to review a little bit later in this presentation of the address insight search. How does that search relate and help us identify that address history so that we have the right investigative tools pointing us in the right directions? And I still cannot figure out the webcam thing, but I will resolve that shortly, I'm sure, while I'm multitasking here. So if I'm going to summarize the county court system and its pros and cons, and there's a lot of content in these slides. We're not going to touch on every single item in here, but just at a high level snapshot, it's a direct source of information. It's where criminal history takes place, it's where it's tried, where dispositions are rendered. So the the snapshot of an individual event's history should be very detailed within the county court system, and the information again is very reliable and up to date. It is considered the source of record for most criminal history information. There's other sources that feed information in, maybe beyond that process, Department of Corrections, things like that. But when you're talking about getting a complete clear picture of a specific incident, if it's in that county, a search of that county court system is going to reveal that information. Now, the cons to such a program is information that's going to exist within one county. You can't find it by searching in neighboring counties. So again, counties are small in their geographic coverage. Additionally, the process for searching them is typically name and date of birth, along with maybe some additional identifiers. So if you think about it, where if you're trying to identify criminal history on a candidate, you're fishing with it's a small net. It's covering a very small area, but the holes within that net are very, very small as well. So if something is in that county and you throw that net into that county, chances are you're going to find that information. So now comparatively, and this is something that I think comes up a lot, is federal courts. How does a federal court system relate to how does a federal court system process a record in relation to a county court system? And I think that you have to take a step back and realize that the federal court system is designed to process cases where it's the United States versus John Doe or Jane Doe versus those county scenarios where we're talking about, where with a county within that state, it's the state of Florida or the state of Pennsylvania or whatever it may be. So the offenses that you're going to find in the federal court system are typically pretty severe. It has to be within the federal crimes code, which is functionally a felony in and of itself, just by making it into that crimes code. And the investigative agencies, the FBI, DA, those type of entities that are involved in that case are typically going after very, very big events. Federal district courts would also try things where there is no clear limitation to the victim coverage of that. So crimes where it's crossing state boundaries. So you're going to get some pretty, when there is a hit, which is rare, but when you do get a hit or a result in the federal district court system, the event is going to be pretty noteworthy, and it's going to the likelihood of that being at least warranting your individual review of that history event in relation to the position sought is probably going to be increased, because by default you're looking at felonies. Now, there are other things in the federal court system. I will say it could be a crime that's occurred on federal property. So I've seen DUIs that occur on a military base that because it occurred on federal property was part of that record was only able to be located in the federal district. But for the most part, you're talking about some pretty substantial events.
So you said these most of these substantial events are pretty severe. What types of records would we miss if we don't run a federal criminal search?
A lot of the big ones that involve interstate stuff. So interstate drug trafficking, because there's there's multiple affected populations across different states. Things like wire fraud, child pornography rings, things like that. So the nature of the crime, in order to even warrant the involvement of a federal law enforcement agency, is typically pretty severe. Also, you've probably all seen on TV where the feds take over the case. They show up on the local sheriff's case and they take it over. But even if we look at the Michael Vick scenario from, I guess it's got to be at least a decade ago now, but where those crimes occurred in Virginia, the Virginia State Police were involved, but then the federal, the FBI came in, and then so he was tried at the federal level for the offenses that were in the crimes code at the federal level, and then while he was in prison for that, he was still attending state court, or actually county court, for additional charges that were specific violations within that state's law. So. That's just one example, but the information, again, if you don't search federal courts, you won't notice a lot of the clears, but it's that one event. And again, we're talking about exceptions here. So when you talk about background screening programs, you talk about identifying the exception. You're talking about identifying that one person that is going to that could you know, get into the program, maybe affect, have access to vulnerable populations, have access to proprietary information with your systems, hurt somebody, whether it be physically or hurt an organization, and then it becomes, it goes into the, then it becomes a bad press incident, and there's several other factors too, just beyond the primary factor for background screening, which is mitigating some of that violence and risk threat. So it's something where if you don't do it and you do enough screening, eventually there will be somebody that has something that you did not identify, and then if and when something negative were to happen out of that, again, not from a fear-mongering standpoint, but just from, inevitably something could happen under that scenario, the exposure is there. So summarizing the federal district court, and I dove a little bit deeper into that court system than I was originally planning, but again, just covering some of the bases here. It is a direct source. It's again, just like the county court system, a very detailed history of each offense. The information is publicly available, and while the federal districts can cover a broader area than counties, for instance, there's no state that, I don't believe there's a state that has more than 4 federal districts. And for reference, the state of New Jersey, pretty large state, just has 1 federal district. So it's a larger net to cover a specific area. The nature of the offenses is more severe on average than the county information. The search process can take a little bit longer. It's initially just a name-based search, and then there's a lot of investigative efforts that take place behind the scenes to validate those matches before reporting that out, looking at dates of birth and other information that's on the system. And then some of the archived information sometimes can take a little bit longer, ordering the case files. So the pros and cons on the basic structure and process for county and federal districts are somewhat similar. Direct sources, comprehensive history of a specific event, but again, name-based searches. So jumping to the next group of systems, and now we're going to start talking a little bit more about databases, or I don't want to say non-source information because that's very specifically defined under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but a state repository is a state agency, a government agency that houses information that's being fed to them from different systems. So if you think about it, the county court system can feed information into a state repository. Local police can feed information into a state repository, but it is by definition a repository, a state-run database of information that's being fed from different agencies that are within their reporting jurisdiction. Also important to note here, federal districts don't report information to the state repositories in that state agency because federal districts report to the feds, counties report to the state. So so there's a whole structure here, but some of the advantages of these state repositories are that they run by they can be processed through SSN and other different variables to try to identify history. The results that come out of them are typically far more aligned with a rap sheet where it's just kind of spotty, general, high-level summary information of an incident that has been reported to that repository. You may have arresting information that doesn't link with the trial information. You may have arresting information for an event that never even went to trial. You may have Department of Corrections information feeding in that doesn't actually tie to a tie to the middle piece. And quite frankly, depending on the size of the state, you put technology in. Some counties will report everything very thoroughly to their state repository. Others will not report anything because the clerk of courts is also the sheriff, who also fishes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So the technology and the infrastructure within that little area does not, permit them to functionally provide that information on a reliable basis.
Greg, do all states have a repository?
Excellent, excellent. What a wonderfully excellent and unscripted question, Teresa Papanikolaou. So yes, all states have a repository, but not all states make their repositories available to the public. So some have some pretty large obstacles to gaining access to them, all the way down to digital fingerprinting. So as a general rule, a state repository is not an available source in every single state in the realm of general background screening. I mean, there's another variant of that, which is considered offices of court administration, which kind of link all of those individual courts within that state, and then it can serve as a pseudo. It's more of a statewide search versus a state repository. But generally speaking, the state repositories have they can have some pretty large fees associated with access to them, and when if they're even available, and then on top of that, the turnaround times too can be pretty substantial. So in most private screening environments, they don't the statewide is not a default search within the kind of the best practices model. Has value, definitely has value. The question is, how long can you wait, and how much do you want to spend? And one last final note on that: they're not publicly accessible. There's no, in line with the question that you asked, Teresa, there's no requirement that they be available to the public. It's not like the county courts and federal court system under the Constitution have to be public record in order for the public to determine that someone was afforded their proper due process. So it's in the Constitution. So state repositories are just, in fact, repositories of that information. So moving it real quick, I'm going to touch on the FBI database. It's not something that comes up a lot in private screening, in type of screening that consumer reporting agencies such as ANSID perform on a routine basis anyway. But it, much like the state repositories, is just that it's a federal repository of information that's being fed in. Its primary purpose is for law enforcement. It's been modified over time to function as an employment screening type tool for specific regulated industries. It could be state or federal regulations, but the access is somewhat complex. And I think to even have a conversation around the FBI database in relation to the items that we're talking about here would be, I think would be overall distracting. But just know that it had, they're very much aware too of the gaps that exist within that process, because they are in fact a repository. If the information isn't reported into them, it's not going to be able to report it out to them. So, and if the counties are reporting to the state, and the state is reporting to the FBI, and can you hear me? Okay, I was muted by the organizer, which I thought was me, but okay. Teresa, just wave your arms in the air if for whatever reason you stop being able to hear me, okay? You're muted now too. Interesting. All right, I'm going to try to cover the rest here, and hopefully everyone can hear me. If you can't hear me, I'm just going to keep plugging away here. Let me know if for whatever reason you cannot hear me through the chat or through the questions. That would be much appreciated.
We can hear you. I think you can hear me now.
Okay, great. So let's talk, let's move on then, if we can, to this is probably the one that warrants the most clarification amongst let's call them the employing public. The multi-jurisdictional database, also known as the National CRIM. It goes by a lot of different names. What it is at its core function is a mass amount of aggregated information that has come from various different sources that have been made available at various different intervals across the country. So it's very much not like the other items that we've talked about today, because it is a non-governmental source. This is it's run by private companies. It's data that's been mined and aggregated and bought and sold and merged and reprocessed and updated. But so as a standalone, it's not a source. And when I say that in terms of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, where it's not, the National Crim database or a multi-jurisdictional database is not trying an individual. It's not rendering a disposition on an individual. It's just housing information that came from a primary source, maybe 1, 2, or 3 steps ago. So this information it's a very powerful investigative tool that we can use in the background screening process, and where it's lined up in that process is critical. The actions that take place when there's a potential match for candidate information is critical, but it is not in and of itself a criminal history result that comes out of a multi-jurisdictional database. A NAC Crim search is by most conventional definitions and by A-Insight's definition of best practices, not a compliant or thorough result.
So, Greg, if the national criminal is not truly a national search, and I get this question a lot, how do you ensure that you aren't missing any criminal records if that is not casting a wide enough net?
Well, so, Teresa Papanicolaou, you're jumping ahead just a little bit here, but it's going to be how we take that address trace information, the address insight information, the candidate provided address history information, what we do with that in the various AKAs, how we're going to run that in the through National Crim and then also through individual jurisdictions, and we'll demonstrate kind of how that works out. The other way you could do it is, again, you could sign up today with Teresa Papanicolaou and ask us to run the 97 federal districts and the 3,000 plus counties on every single candidate that you process. But it's again, that's not a realistic solution. So it's more combining these things to ensure that you're getting the most accurate picture that you can for the candidate, all while referencing the very, very first piece of information we relayed in this presentation, which is that there is no single source for all criminal history that can occur within a candidate. So let's get, I guess, into some of this. There's some pros and cons here on the National Crim searches. I believe we covered most of them. The only other one I want to call out here is that there's a lot of other information that's been merged within or into these data sources. So we have OFAC searches, sex offender registries, all sorts of government lists and excluded party type lists that have been merged into these. So that, again, it's a very valuable tool in being able to identify and run frontline potential investigative jurisdictional direction stuff for the process. But and I guess the best way to do it is just functionally to demonstrate it here. So we have a chart, and it's kind of like the pros and cons grid of these individual items. So down the left-hand side, and let me get out my little fancy laser pointer here. Down the left-hand side here, we have the different sources that we've talked about. And then from an accuracy and compliance perspective, how accurate is the information on a specific event, not the entire candidate's history, but a specific event of specific arrest. How accurate and thorough is that entire case? The county and the federal district is where you're going to find that wherever it was originally tried, whether it's here or here, that's where you're going to get the information on that. The net gets a little bit wider on the state coverage here and the FBI database stuff, but it's still official source information as far as the FCRA is concerned, but it is secondhand. It's been reported from a lower entity up to it. I'm still going to quantify county and federal districts as the direct source because it also aligns with the data. And then is the information standalone compliant? So basically, can I take the information as a consumer reporting agency, and as long as I've maintained the procedures of the FCRA to ensure maximum possible accuracy, and then when there's criminal history, is it up to date from the best possible source? It would satisfy, these three things would satisfy those items as defined within the Act. The search criteria can vary quite a bit. State repositories vary quite a bit because they're not all available. Some allow you to search by SSN, some require name and date of birth, some require just a name with the DOB. So there's different variables here, but and then just the availability charts. So this would be kind of how how I would summarize the primary sources, and then what the next steps would be to creating a program.
So just to clarify, what you're saying there is that the courthouses, the actual county and federal courthouses where cases are actually tried, those are the best sources of information, and that might not even exist at the state, FBI, or national level.
Yeah, I mean, if think about it this way, if you had the case number ahead of time, the place that you would go to get the details in that case number would be the county court, or if it was a federal case number, federal court system. So that's going to tell you the story from, definitely that starting at the time that they were the charges were filed, all the way through its disposition and ideally its sentencing. It'll also tell you some back history information of the arrest date, the arresting offense, depending on the court system. It's a lot of detail in there. So you can pull from that and identify and pretty much tell the entire story of a case within there. That case number can then be reported down the line within the state, and then to the FBI repository, and maybe the National Crim Database grabbed that information at some point, and that's being reported out too. But go to the source. You go to the source. So real quick, I want to talk about the address trace, or in this case, so what at ANSITE we call the address insight. This tool allows you to identify names and address history for a candidate. And so you take this name information, you take the address information, whether it's provided or if we get it from a tool like Address Insight, what we would call it's developed. So you have provided information, you have developed information. You merge all that information together to identify the individual's basic demographics or potential demographics. You run that information, those variables, through a national criminal database, while at the same time you're running the individual county and federal districts on all those items, and trying to paint that complete picture, because again, criminal history takes place in the regions where someone has lived, worked, or went to school. Just statistically, that's what it shows. It's very rare that someone's going to travel well outside of an area that they have any association with for the sole purpose of committing a crime and then coming back. I mean, it happens, but these address trace tools have become very sophisticated over time. It could identify if you've gotten mail, or if you've rented the same beach house, a couple different times. Those addresses can start to show up, and you're not interested in the address itself. You're interested in the jurisdiction. If someone was a Philadelphia resident, but they have, if they went to the Jersey Shore every single summer, you're going to want to try to identify that, because that's an area of association. Not that I have anything against people going to the Jersey Shore. So you're taking that.
On that note, Greg, there's great tools out there. ANSITE has developed a web form to collect that address, that candidate provided address history, very simple manner to get it from application and into processing.
Yeah, we have a lot of tools. The industry itself has a lot of tools, and as far as ANSITE, we have some very sophisticated tools that are built around being able to collect this additional information up front, whether it be what we call web form or web-based disclosure and authorization. So we're taking all the information that's being provided by the candidate, and we're also taking the information that we're developing on that candidate to then merge this into a process that pretty much gets us to where we are here, which is the best practices model of it. We're running the address trace, we're running the national crim, concurrently with this information, and then we're also running the county and federal district with all the different potential information pieces that came out of here to really identify that history. And again, if you want to add the state repositories, you can. It can affect turnaround time. Regulated industries sometimes do that by preference. So it's there and it's available. But for the most part, and just even on a personal note, this is the same scope that we apply to, and same level of due diligence that ANSITE applies to all of our employees. So we process tremendous amounts of person identifiable information. We have a lot of proprietary systems and information that presents substantial risk that needs to be mitigated. And this isn't just something that we're recommending for the purposes of a webinar or anything. I mean, this is what the same exact level of due diligence that we apply on our own team members. And then you add other things as appropriate to different positions, education, employment history, all that other stuff. But this should be the core, in my opinion, of any criminal history package that you're running. So let's get into some I think this is a pretty good way to demonstrate the information that we're discussing here. On the left-hand side, we have some candidate provided information for Susan A. Smith, not a real person, by the way. And then we have let's just say what the Address Insight found. So what Susan A. Smith provides that she resides in Pasco, Florida. We run an Address Insight and we identify several name variables. We align on the DOB and SSN, but we also identified some additional jurisdictions. And let's just say, for the purpose of this argument, that we know in advance that this is Susan's history. Some of it's filed under different names. So we have Susan Smith, Susan Jones, Sue Ann Smith. So we have several different events here spread across several different jurisdictions. And if we were going to apply just a very minimal level due diligence package, so let's just call it a level 1, you're talking about running a current county and federal district only on the name that was provided. So you're not taking into account any of this information. The only areas that we're searching, Pasco, Florida, and the Middle District of Florida, and they're both going to come back clear. Susan's going to be clear, even though we know behind the scenes, because we are omniscient and know everything. Everybody on this call, we all know everything about background screening. So we know that this information was out there, but is never going to be caught, and this person would clear the process. You up that just one little bit. You keep the county and fed searches. But you also add all the developed addresses from Address Insight, but you only run it under the current name. You're not taking into account any of the aliases, AKAs, associated names. So now we're going to start to get a little bit more information. We're going to have our first hit in this this Pennsylvania Federal District, but everything else, we're going to search different areas and they're going to come back clear because of name variables and things that are not part of this level 2 search. If we just take that up one additional level, now we've identified almost everything. I mean, this is a pretty comprehensive program, federal district, county and federal district, everything developed from Address Insight, along with the current and AKA names. So the only thing that we're missing in this scenario is the National Criminal Database search, because that has not been added to this package. That National Criminal Database is going to identify this one event that happened in Chester, Pennsylvania, Chester County, Pennsylvania, but was not part of the candidate's identified address history. So we've had, up until this point, we've had no reason to look here, but because the Pennsylvania court record information has been made available for one reason or another, it shows up within the National Crim. And now, based on these search parameters and this package process, what I call the best practices package, we've got the proper pointers and the proper name variables to go into all these different directions, search this information, and ideally return this thing within, on the criminal court process with all these hits and stuff, 2.5 days, 3.5 days, based on business days, based off of how much information had to be pulled from the courts. Notice I didn't mention what year any of these offenses were or anything. That could change a little bit, but now, whether or not this information is enough to eliminate the person from the position being sought, that's a separate conversation. That's EEO guidance. That's EEOC guidance. That's company policy, adjudication. That's a whole separate conversation. That's definitely not part of this webinar. But what we do have here is just a breakdown of how these things would line up, and then at least it allows you as the employer to make an informed decision around this candidate and their history, and ultimately decide whether or not the risk is applicable to the position being sought, and know that you're making a decision off of actionable intelligence. Another thing that comes up quite a bit is just the term 7 years. We see this in RFPs. I'm sure Teresa sees this in quite a few RFPs as well. There's
a lot of confusion around it sometimes.
Yeah, organizations saying, do I want a 7-year search? What is 7 years? What the FCRA limits non-conviction reporting to 7 years, but what about, is a 7-year search a search of the court for 7 years, or is it a search? To me, the 7-year search is identifying 7 years worth of address history, a minimum of 7 years worth of associated address and name history for a candidate, and then taking that information and searching the individual court jurisdictions for whatever the parameters are within your company policy and what the courts have available to them. So, a search of the predominantly used index for all information related to that individual, and then scoping it from there. So for me, and the 7-year scope is identifying the candidate's address history for at least the last 7 years, and then using that to develop and point the search process from there. The other aspect of 7 years comes into play when information is being reported back. There's FCRA limitations on 7 years. There's EEOC guidance on use of information and how relevant. There's the different state laws. That's a whole nother thing, which again, we do specialize in those applications as well. But for the purposes of this, that's how I would apply the term 7 year as far as scope to this. So, Teresa, I went through a lot, in this content. I don't know if you want to bring us home here and run through that, and then hopefully we have time. Yeah, we've got time for some questions. So if you can go ahead and bring us home and
sure. And thank you so much for all that information. I feel like I always learn something from it. So, quick info for those of you that may not know who A-Insight is, and to give you some relevance, we've been providing background screening, drug testing, and workflow solutions for over 30 years. One of our biggest things is, we haven't just shared all of this with you for no reason. We put a big effort towards preserving quality and service in the way that we perform our background checks, specifically in that we cast a wider net. When we search for criminal records, we utilize statewide upgrades. We have great coverage of the CAM report system. And of course, we maintain compliance, FCRA compliance with any database search that we're doing. We put a big effort forth to give our clients affordability for those address development and alias name, maiden name searches that Greg discussed to ensure that our clients can cast that really wide net when we are able to develop a deep address history. Anytime we go to the court, we really try to go directly to the court access. Usually, if we can get it electronically, it's going to be a little bit faster. But if that court does not have good electronic sources, we do send runners to the court. We pull those records so that you're getting the most accurate information possible. Finally, all of the information is sent through a quality assurance review under the FCRA for the reportability, making sure that it's legal to report to you, that you actually want to see that information, and that you have all the tools that you need to identify that. Really, one of the things that we do really well, and Greg sort of touched on it, is we use 7 years of address history as sort of a standard, and we search the court index for as much as the court allows. A lot of CRAs will restrict how far back they search on the index to 7 years, and simply it's a cost-effective solution for them, because then any records that are older than 7 years don't have to go through that quality assurance review that we're doing. But we do ensure that we provide everything that we receive from the court, regardless of age, as long as it's reportable. Again, in compliance with the FCRA, always. What we'll do now is go into the Q&A. We do have a few questions, Greg, so I'll go ahead and read them off to you. And just so everybody knows, you will be receiving a follow-up email from us at the close of today's presentation. It'll give you infographic with the details and the highlights of today's presentation, so you can have it on hand. So the first question, probably the most popular.
Yeah, I want to cherry pick one of these because I was looking at the question. Sorry, you were doing an excellent job summarizing the company. I definitely couldn't have done it better myself, but I must admit that I was multitasking and reading some of the questions, and I'd like to grab just a couple of these real quick, if you don't mind, and then see where the rest falls out. So, one of the questions was, what about expunged records? How do they show up on the reports? So by definition, the expunged record should not show up on the report because if you're searching, again, one of those primary sources, whether it be the federal district or the county court, and the information is expunged, it should not be in the county court or the federal district. So one of the first things that I think of when I hear that someone's getting a record that's been expunged, outside of the scenario where the court did not actually officially expunge it, but if it truly is an expunged item and you are getting it on your background check result, then chances are that came out of what I would consider more of a non-direct source, so a state repository, or in the worst case scenario, and I can't imagine that this would occur within the within a Insight, but if your company is providing national crim results as is, they could report something because they don't know that it's been expunged, but the defendant and their legal representation had since filed for it to be expunged at the source, but there's no direct obligation or connection between the database provider to go back and update their information and report it as such. So expungement is a big item that from time to time we'll be processing it, and some of our public records team and the public records leadership will reach out directly to me and like, we have this case, and here it indicates that there was a petition for expungement, but it was never actually expunged. How do we want to handle it? And we go through a whole process and actually break that stuff down. And that's while processing hundreds of thousands of these searches. I mean, if a company's doing this right, when that term comes up, expunge, petition for expungement, anything like that, there should be, the company should be putting eyes on that item and addressing it. And if they're not, then Teresa Papanicolaou is your person, and you should reach out to her at the email address that's on the slide. So
I thought something you said there that was really interesting was that, if your CRA is reporting records out of the national crim as is, then you might see these expunged records being reported to you. Can you describe more why a CRA would report records as is and why a Insight does not do that?
Because it's easy and cheap, and if you can get away with it long enough, then everything works out great. Or they're sending out some kind of what's called a 613 notice, which under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, arguably you can report whatever you want out of any source if you just happen to also tell the consumer that, hey, we're reporting some adverse information about you. I'm not a big fan of that process. I think it's confusing to a consumer. My personal preference is if there's any information that's being indicated as a potential hit within a database, that is just used as an investigative tool to go into that specific county and pull that information from the source that is, as the 613 clause of the FCRA states, up to date and from the best possible source. That would be our approach. I mean, there's a lot of organizations apply a lot of different models. They apply address trace information that only develops up to 3 addresses because they don't want to add a bunch of counties into a single, all-you-can-eat county and federal district and name package for, just for the sake of this conversation, and let's throw a number out there like $50. They're going to charge you $50 every single time you run a background check on somebody, and no matter how many counties is developed, 10 or 5 or 1 and 3 different names, you're going to get that same price. But then they can sometimes play games behind the scenes and use a tool that only identifies up to 3 addresses. So they're just kind of hedging the bets on that, and but if you're doing background screening that matters, if you're trying to identify that one exception event, if you're a college or a university and you're talking about access to vulnerable populations, public safety, or if you're talking about a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week warehouse facility where people can often be somewhat unsupervised for large periods of time, and you want to protect the people that are in that workplace, I just don't think that's where you cut corners. I think you can get away with it for a little while, but eventually the chickens come home to roost. I guess that's how you say it. I don't know. I live in Florida, but I'm not from the South, so that was my best attempt at that one.
Right. We have some other questions, Greg. This is probably a really top of mind for everybody. They're wondering what would be the cost per candidate for that recommended or best practices package.
I think it really depends on the industry you're in, and some of the other factors that you would have to take into account. It can, I mean, it's such a tough question to answer without actually at least consulting, even just for 5 minutes, on the type of program that you have. But if the majority of the people that are hired at your organization are under an ex-convict rehabilitation program, the price for that package is going to be very different because it's 100% hit rate, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's just understanding what that program is, the process. Again, the fail safes that we have in play in our process are to make sure that we match adverse information correctly with that candidate before it's reported out. And so those touch points, those value add touch points, are the things that we really measure out. I mean, if you go out there and you look around, you'll see packages similar to the stuff that I was discussing. Some will list them for $35, some will list them for $50, some will list them for $80, some will list them for $12, but then but the details aren't there. So it really is, there's so much in the details about what is the scope, what is the process, how are these things being lined out, and also what is the nature of your business. So I hope I didn't tap dance around that too much. It's just very tough for me to put a firm answer on that without understanding the program, because we want to run background checks, and we want to provide programs and solutions that help your organization, and we also want to make sure that you're getting what you need while we're also getting what we need to continue to ensure the level of the quality of the personnel that we have on our teams that do all this great work. So
yeah, and some of that work, especially with a high hit ratio, can be very labor intensive on our side. So all those factors have to be taken into consideration when we consult with prospective clients. We have some more questions. This one I think is pretty good. If my county were to pass a new law that bans background checks, will the system notify me?
So it's a somewhat of a broad question. I'm going to assume the application of this would be more kind of the ban the box and fair chance acts, where you can only run certain types of background checks, or utilize certain types of information. And we do put a lot of educational sessions together out there around these subjects. We post information. We send blasts when certain events happen. Some of these are applicable only to state entities. So I think it would really depend on the notice and its application. But yeah, I mean, we have different notification methods for any time stuff like that were to occur. And quite frankly, if there's enough of them, we also do webinars just like this. We last year, even during the pandemic, we were doing sessions on some of the newer things that were a little bit outside of that. So, FMCSA stuff and different laws that went into effect. But I anticipate that there will be a lot of notifications coming out around that stuff, particularly in 2021, because there's a lot of bills that have been collecting dust that the people are now dusting off and trying to figure out how to apply for within individual states and counties.
I mean, I imagine if something as restrictive as an actual ban on background checks in a county came through, I mean, when a system like reflects a system like AI, just restricts the ability to do it.
Yeah, I mean,
in an ideal world.
Yeah, I mean, and the odds of successfully banning background checks altogether would be, I mean, there better be some pretty big safe harbor clauses within that for anything that happens within that. I would guess if that's going to happen anywhere, it'd be California, but that's I guess a conversation for another day too. So
we've got some more questions, so I guess we should trek on through. If our policy is set to search a criminal background for 7 years, look back to the 7 years very confusing. If our policy is set to search criminal background for 7 years, why are we often receiving data for much further back than 7 years?
So one of the things I think you want to make, and it would be to fully understand, the policy and its application, something to keep in mind is the 7-year scope for reporting of information is for convictions and for instance and felony convictions for a lot of the custom policies that I've seen is 7 years from the later of date of disposition, release, or parole. Couple of general rules of thumb: a misdemeanor is punishable by up to 2 years in prison, and then greater than 2 years in prison is typically felony rules. I mean, it varies by state and some other things, but so if you think about someone that's been convicted of a felony and say they receive 5 years in prison, it wouldn't be advisable to only look at the date that they were disposed, because they were also in prison for the last 5 years, or or say it was 6 years or even 7 years. If the day they got out of prison, you really don't have an indicator to determine whether or not that person would be likely to reoffend, because they haven't been a member of the public. So even the general application, some of the original FCRA language was very specific to date of disposition, release, or parole, which would be the later of. So the offense could have occurred 10 years ago in a 7-year policy. They could have gotten 3 or 4 years in prison. Then the disposition, the disposition time frame would have put that within the last, 10 years, so then 6 years. So that could be a reportable element under your policy. But again, it's a matter of just clarifying that information, because you're talking about reportability. If your policy is to only look back, you want to make sure that the CRA is reporting within that policy, and that you're all speaking the same language.
Little FCRA 101.
Yeah. There's so many layers to that I could do 30 minutes on that alone. But I hope that was helpful. Yeah. So I see a new one too. How can more IDs for federal court? How can you get more IDs for federal courts records? Am I understanding that correct?
More identifiers, probably.
Federal court records are particularly cumbersome in matching up the results, because it is just an initial name-based search, and then you have to you get certain information back, and then you have to kind of comb through that and look for driver's license number, SSN within some of the filings, DOB within there. There's information that's functionally embedded in there, but as of today, it is not part of, let's just call it, the public access research process. So the more identifiers that we have on a candidate when there is a potential result, help us to either determine if this is in fact your candidate, or more importantly, is this someone that is not your candidate? I mean, the act of reporting a clear and the act of reporting a record, it's very debatable which has greater importance. But we want to report accurate information, and we need to make sure, even if it comes down to sometimes matching, kind of like signature strokes on the case filings, and getting information from the prosecuting attorney's office to try to link some of that stuff up. So there's it's not always fast. Common names can be particularly time consuming in that process, but we also have an excellent history of reporting accurately on those things, to which at a level that I haven't seen at a lot of other CRAs. So
okay, do you think we have time for one more question and then we can wrap up? There's no more.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely.
So the question is that they are aware that there is at least one state that will not release criminal data to third parties. They will release it to them directly, but not to the third party CRA. How do CRAs alert them that that jurisdiction did not provide the CRA the data?
Well, it couldn't be a county or a federal district, so we have to be talking about a state repository in this scenario, right?
Got to be a
Again,
fingerprint,
yeah.
some type of situation.
So I guess some of it's in the configuration and structure of the packaging that would be ordered, whether or not it's through an HRIS or ATS integration. But in some scenarios, there's state-specific packages where we're adding a state repository search on top of the other elements because it has proven to have value for one reason or another to that particular end user. But by default, we're not going to charge and process a statewide where it's not available. But yeah, again, every state repository, as an individual, you can walk in and kind of get your own record. But there are a whole host that, again, just don't make the information available to CRAs. So if we have that list identified up front, we know all of the states and what their access requirements are. We know some of them where if they really want to do it, we can do a fingerprint card and process that. But again, it's time consuming and cumbersome to a consumer. So but we've got all that information mapped out in our systems. It's physically impossible for us to process in our proprietary operating system a statewide search that does not, that is not available to us as a CRA. I hope that answered the question. If you have any other questions, if you're currently, and anybody that attended this, if you're currently one of our customers or partners with AInsight, and you have additional questions, please do reach out to your customer service rep, your national account manager, anybody that you interact with, at Applicant Insight, anybody in our customer support team, they'll be happy to help out. If you are new to AInsight, you're looking to maybe change providers, look at your program, just consult on what might be the best approach for you. Teresa's contact information is on the screen. If you are not quite sure that you'll get that email address right, you could always just do info@AInsight and it'll somehow make its way to Teresa and the rest of our sales team. But yeah, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to attend this. Sorry about some of the brief technical difficulties. Thought about recording it in advance, but we'll figure it out. Let's do it live and see how well that works out. I think it went well.
You're doing okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you everyone for joining us today.